I feel like my talk today should come with a health warning now. I struggled a little bit when I got the invitation to talk about this topic because I thought, I haven't actually done any new research on the experiences of queer Muslims, either in Malaysia or Britain. I finished my PhD, I passed in 2015. My book came out in 2018. But as Fatu has introduced, my work now is at the intersections, mostly of activism and scholarship on new religions, on climate justice, and so on. So not really on queer Muslims. The reason why I said yes, though, was given who I am and the kind of research that I did. I mean, I identify as gay and Muslim. I'm still in touch with lots of the people that I encountered. I still keep up with quite a few things that are happening in the activist scene, in the scholarly scene. So I thought it might be useful for me to share some reflections and some new thoughts that I have based on these developments, hence the title, The Making of a Good Gay Muslim, Navigating Post-Colonial Politics in Contemporary Britain. So, but now that I've done the apology, let's get stuck into it. So I've stopped sharing the screen because I want to look at your reactions now before I share the next slide. Have any of you heard of someone called Amru Al-Qadi? If you can use the raise hand function on Zoom, or put in the chat if you know who I'm talking about. Amru Al-Qadi or Glamru. Okay, one of you knows, that's good. I've got applause from Amber. All right, okay, so a couple of you have heard of Amru. Most of you haven't, so you're in for a treat now. I'm just gonna play you a clip that's a couple of minutes long and I'll explain why, but here goes.
Hello, Wembley. We live in a world of contradictions. As society has become more diverse, politics is retaliated by going backwards. Cruel behaviors we'd never tolerate from our friends, we somehow seek out in our lovers. Pretty much every person I know illegally streams thousands of pounds worth of TV and film whilst moralizing over the person who steals a packet of chewing gum from Boots. And scientifically, the very foundation of our world is full of contradictions. Contradictions have come to govern my life. As a queer person raised Muslim, contradictions of belief systems almost tore me apart. And my mother, more than anybody I know, has embodied the contradictions that follow me everywhere I go. In the same breath, she is the most vociferous critic of my gender nonconformism, as well as the person who's probably encouraged it the most. My mother was raised in an Iraqi household, a Muslim household, and she inherited very conservative views about sexuality and gender, most of which she's never shirked. When she found my gay porn at the age of 15, she cried every single night and would not look at me for a considerable period of time. When I started dressing up like this, my mother responded by throwing away any piece of clothing that had so much as a pink stitch in them. But for her strictness, it was her overt and absurdly camp performance of femininity that allowed me to feel like I had a home in the Middle East, and that probably taught me how to be a drag queen.
So you can listen to the rest of that talk on YouTube. It's TEDx. It's a TEDx talk. And in case you haven't clocked it already, Amru Al-Qadi, or their drag name Glamru, is a Muslim drag queen, a British Muslim drag queen. And this was a talk that they gave in 2019. It was around the time their book Life as a Unicorn came out, and I'll be signposting that now. I'll talk a bit more about that later. And I just thought this was interesting because when I started doing my field work, this is 10 years ago now, you know, even at that point, it wasn't new to have someone speaking in public about their experiences of being queer and Muslim. That was already happening. I think what is interesting now is just the context. You know, this is someone who is in full drag, who uses neuter pronouns. Amru identifies as non-binary. It's for TEDx, right? And it's for a British Muslim audience or a mixed audience. And this is why I don't want to get hung up on the question of audience too much. Like who are these people that Amru is speaking to? Who are they telling their story to? But anyway, some key words jumped out at me, and I have read the book, and I do find it really interesting, and I'd highly recommend it to people who are interested in these developments. You know, so it starts off with this idea of contradictions, right? The contradiction of growing up queer and Muslim. And then there's the illusion that there is some kind of trauma that needs to be discussed, some kind of conflict. In this case, the conflict is with the mother. But in this story of trauma and conflict and contradiction, we see the seeds of what we know will come, a kind of reconciliation, a putting together of an identity as a Muslim drag queen, right, in a British context. It's a kind of Muslim recovery narrative. I don't think it's peculiar to queer Muslims. We find this in a lot of other progressive Muslim narratives as well, for lack of a better word, liberal Muslim narratives, this kind of hero's journey of discovery, of overcoming adversity to find yourself as a Muslim in this day and age. I think there are a few things that need to be there in the back of our minds. So when these stories are told, it's not just who they are being told to, but where they are being told and when and by whom. So that's going to be, these are some of the themes that I'm going to unpack a bit further in my talk today. And finally, these key words, these key themes of contradiction, conflict, reconciliation of an identity. Where does this fit with the idea, with the word good that I had in my title, the making of the good gay Muslim? I mean, I'm talking to a bunch of you at this seminar hosted by the Islam UK Center. I can do shorthand now. You know what I'm talking about. This trope of the good Muslim, bad Muslim, Mahmoud Mamdani, the good Muslim as someone who's compliant, doesn't rock the boat of Western hegemony, the bad Muslim, portrayed as the one who's a bit too religious, but actually, it's the ones that are politicized and will dare to, do something about the system. And question global Western colonial dominance and governance and so on. That's all fine, but I'm thinking now with the narrative of Islam and sexuality that we have in a country like the UK, where does that leave gay Muslims? What is a good gay Muslim then? What is a bad gay Muslim? Good to whom? Bad to whom? Good by whose definition? Bad by whose definition? And I think these sorts of narratives by people like Glamru can tell us a lot about where is this mix of factors, in this political terrain. And of course, some of this is also personal. So some of this is connected to my personal story. So this is the reflexive bit of my talk. So I was born and raised in Malaysia. I went to Australia for my university studies. And then, yeah, I moved to the UK slightly more than a decade ago. So I, have lived with the experience of being gay and Muslim in 3 different countries, and have had different things, different contradictions that I've had to deal with as well, as Glamru has told us about in their introduction to their story. So growing up Muslim in Malaysia, there were, of course, anxieties, not just about my sexuality, but about whether I was a good Muslim within that environment. But then going to Australia in the late 90s, there was a rude awakening. I wasn't just exposed to homophobia in Australia. I was exposed to quite nasty Islamophobia and racism and xenophobia as well, right? And at this time in the late 90s, there was a political crisis in Malaysia where our deputy prime minister at the time, Anwar Ibrahim, was sacked from office on charges of corruption and sodomy. So there were all these external events that were triggering personal crises for me about my sexuality, about my spirituality. And this was a couple of years before 9/11, which was another kind of trauma, right? By this time, I had gone back to Malaysia. My studies in Australia were also sponsored by an oil company, Petronas, the Malaysian state-owned oil and gas company. I was doing some research at this point about the oil and gas industry and found out about assassinations of human rights activists and environmentalists around the world with the collusion of the oil industry. So there was that kind of crisis happening within me as well. So I've been on a bit of a journey since then, which has brought me here speaking to you today. So this kind of thing that I'm talking about, this kind of hero's journey, the narrative, the putting this into creative form, I've done this as well. So before I came to the UK to do my master's and PhD, I quit my job at Petronas. I had to work with them for a while, but I found myself in the activist scene in Malaysia and also in the theater and music scene where, you know, one of my, my only full-length play to date was staged by a prominent Malaysian theatre company, Instant Cafe Theatre. My play was called Aircon. It's basically about the homophobic and transphobic bullying in an elite boys' school in Malaysia. And it also touches upon issues of, you know, racial and religious privilege and so on, because this is an environment where Islam plays a really central role in shaping these boys' lives, you know, in a multicultural context, you know, where is Islam as the majority state religion, right? And yeah, how do themes like homophobia and transphobia play out? Now, I was really worried when this play got staged because it was staged in 2008. So the Deputy Prime Minister I was talking about, Anwar Ibrahim, got released from jail a few years before that, was trying to make a comeback and was standing for a by-election. He was leader of opposition at this stage in Malaysian politics. And smack in the middle of his election campaign, he gets accused with a second round of sodomy allegations. So the Malaysian political scene was rife with sodomy all over again, political homophobia everywhere. This is when this play was staged. So I was terrified. I thought, is it going to be shut down? You know, Malaysia is an authoritarian regime. These sorts of topics are, you know, you have to find ways to stage them. Surprisingly, the authorities left this play alone. I think because it's theater, so it's slightly more difficult to police theater in Malaysia compared to film and television and books and so on. And it became a hit. It won lots of awards. It had an online revival last year as Malaysia was in lockdown. So they took archival footage of the first staging and, you know, compiled it as an online screening. And I was surprised at just how enthusiastic the reception for it still was. So this is the context. So this is why I'm interested in the sort of creative cultural products, cultural producers navigating themes of Islam and sexuality, but this time in a British context, right? So let's focus here. Why focus here? I think lots of interesting stuff has happened in the last 10 years in the UK. So, you know, there's that gay Muslim storyline in EastEnders, right, which premiered in 2009. When I was doing my fieldwork, I did it in Malaysia and the UK. And in the UK, I focused on the LGBTQ Muslim organization, Iman. And I think some of their members were consulted by the scriptwriters of EastEnders just to get a sense of the experience of being queer and Muslim in the UK. So they were kind of consultants to the storyline. But also when the storyline premiered, apparently the online membership of Iman doubled overnight, from 1,500 people on the online forum to something like 3,000 overnight. So that was a moment, right? The EastEnders storyline. That same year, there was a play by Alia Bano, which won, I think, a new writing award at the Royal Court Theatre. It didn't have a prominent, it wasn't about queer Muslim experiences, but there was a very obvious, explicit queer Muslim subplot, which I thought was interesting. And, you know, it became a foil for discussions about different contestations and expressions of Islam in the UK. And I found it interesting because it's written by a Muslim playwright, right? A Muslim woman playwright. And then in the years after that, you know, there was the documentary Muslim Drag Queens, which was on Channel 4. I actually know a couple of the people there who were around when I was doing my research with Iman. You can see them here with Sir Ian McKellen. Some of you might remember that other reality series, miniseries, Muslims Like Us, which featured, you know, a gay Muslim member of the cast as well. This was around the time my book came out, 2018. My book came out. That was the same year that another play was staged, which won the Papa Tango Prize, The Funeral Director by Iman Qureshi. And this time, queer Muslim experiences were front and center. This was a play about this experience, right? Written by a Muslim playwright in the UK. And then, of course, there was Amru Al-Qadi's Life as a Unicorn. We've heard a bit from them. This is a memoir. And then last year, I don't know how many of you saw We Are Lady Parts, which I absolutely love. This is a brilliant sitcom on Channel 4 about a Muslim women's punk group. Fantastic. But I felt that there was also quite a nuanced queer Muslim subplot here. So what do we do with all of this now? You know, this is just the tip of the iceberg. I'm not being exhaustive with this list. There's probably other things that you can think of. I was thinking about this and I thought I really liked the image that Sophie Gilliard-Ray had in her book, Muslims in Britain, writing about, I think what was the expression, Muslims in Britain, because of the ways in which Islam is put under the public spotlight, Muslims are always compelled to talk about, you know, being a Muslim. It's a forced telling of the self, right? I like that phrase. I forget where it exactly comes from. But I thought, yeah, so then these cultural products are about a telling of the self as well. And they tell us about the constraints of the cultural and media and political environment in the UK with regard to Islam and sexuality. But they also tell us about the possibilities and opportunities, right? So what are the constraints? I'll come to this later. So it makes me think of Du Bois's double consciousness. I mean, Du Bois was talking about the experiences of African Americans, you know, formerly enslaved African Americans in the US, you know, in the early 20th century. But I think this kind of double consciousness, we can think about in relation to queer Muslims as well. Because what are the things that pull in different directions? On one hand, there's the strand of sort of what Jasbir Puar calls homo nationalism, right? This pressing into service of, you know, liberal sexual politics as a way of justifying Western global military dominance, you know, from invasions of Iraq, Afghanistan, and so on. So, you know, the West as this defender of LGBT rights, and therefore it needs to police and manage all these sort of hostile Muslim environments. I mean, I'm not being very articulate here, but you get the idea. And we've seen this happen in relation to global feminism as well, right? So the pretext for the US invasion of Afghanistan was to save these poor Afghan women from the burqa, you know, this kind of Orientalist, colonialist idea of feminism. So there's that on one hand, and there's this cluster of concepts, homo nationalism, Joseph Massad's Gay International, Securitization of Islam by Stuart Croft. And what I'm interested in today, so the word colonial, I'll come back to it, you know, why I think it's important to go back to people like Syed Hussein Alatas, you know, the sociology of knowledge, where do these categories come from and how do they persist in different settings? But also, I don't want to just leave it there. In terms of the spotlight analogy, how are queer Muslims, people who are producing these creative works, how are they engaging in what Miriam Cook calls multiple critique? How are they using Islam as a cultural resource to respond to this environment? I think that's interesting. Now, I know that this is the Islam UK Center, and there might be an expectation from some people listening, maybe, that I am going to talk about Islamic attitude to sexual diversity or sexual minorities. I'm not going to do that. I don't have time for it today. And besides, there are other sources out there that do this way better than I could in, you know, a short afternoon talk. So here are some of the works that you can consult. You know, there's this discussion in my book as well. But anyway, now that that disclaimer is out of the way, let's go back to context. So what is the political context that these queer Muslims that I'm talking about are navigating? So in the last 10 years, I think this has been interesting in the UK. And I have, you know, partly I've chosen the last decade or so because that's when I've been here and been able to see and experience these things myself and analyze them and conduct research around them and so on. But also I think it's genuinely interesting. We have the Equality Act now, you know, which was very interesting even in the way that the negotiations around it happened, the way it was crafted and drafted. There's been the Same-Sex Marriage Act. Alongside this, we've seen the expansion of counterterrorism policies. There have been, mass public violence, incidents of mass public violence, both by Islamic State and also by far-right white supremacists. There's been Brexit. There's been right-wing populism in the wake of that. And then suddenly in 2016, there was that moment, that amazing moment after, you know, the London mayoral elections with the dog whistle Islamophobic politics in the campaign. Suddenly Sadiq Khan becomes mayor. And I remember for me, you know, it was Sadiq Khan and then Nadia Hussain wins Great British Bake Off and everyone's like, wow, Muslims in Britain finally taking over, you know. And then, of course, there have been other things happening as well, right? There's been an ongoing refugee crisis, the Windrush scandal, hostile environment. In 2019, I don't know, I haven't kept up with this, but there were those protests as well in Birmingham, right? About the schools that were doing the RSE syllabus, reproductive and sex education syllabus protests by some Muslim parents that made the headlines. And of course, since COVID, since 2020, we've seen a step change. There's been the movement for Black Lives as well, which has spurred people to think more about racial justice, economic justice, the persistence of colonial governance, and so on. So there's that's the context. I mean, and before that, there've been Muslims in the news in this country since at least the Rushdie affair, right? Which has created this environment of how Muslims are thought of, how they observe themselves, you know. So all these are things that I think affect the double consciousness, not just of Muslims in Britain, queer Muslims as well in Britain. So this is where I think these creative works that I'm talking about, that I'm referring to, are interesting. So going back to double consciousness, because now I'd like to think about, so what exactly is being responded to? What are the raw materials for this response? So going back to Du Bois's double consciousness, what is this? I've already alluded to it. It's the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others. And of course, this is something you can apply to the experiences of many different marginalized groups, right? Black people in Britain, Roma and traveler communities. So you can use this in many different ways. In relation to the experiences of queer Muslims, as I've said, there's that dualistic pole on the one hand. You know, are you going to comply or agree with this homo-nationalist agenda, what Massad calls the gay international, this kind of Orientalist idea that Muslims and Muslim societies are inherently homophobic and need to be challenged, and queer Muslims need to be saved, and the West is the savior of secular liberal values, including LGBT rights. But alongside this, as I've said, with the expansion of counterterrorism policies, there's also the continued securitization of Muslims, right? So how does this affect the experiences of queer Muslims? What are they responding to? And again, I think that there's there's a colonial legacy here, right? Because just coming from a Malaysian context, it's so clear that sexuality and religion are such powerful tools of colonial governance. You know, they were tools of divide and rule, and they continue to be tools of divide and rule. So yeah, how are people navigating this? Might be interesting to look at a case study now. So I don't know how many of you remember the Orlando, the mass public shooting at Pulse nightclub, which was a queer nightclub in Orlando in 2016. And it happened at a really fraught time, right? This was Donald Trump was not yet president, but you know, his campaign was picking up steam. It was the year of Brexit. This did happen a year after the attacks on the Islamic State attacks in Paris, the Bataclan attacks. And it was not very long after the Charlie Hebdo affair as well, right? So it grabbed the headlines. It was a horrific tragedy, you know, no doubt. And actually lots of the people who died were queer and trans people of color in the US. So it was a tragedy, it was awful. But how was it talked about, especially in the British media landscape? So I'm going to choose a couple of quotes now. So trigger warning, extreme Islamophobia alert, but I think it's interesting to pick up this quote because this is a quote by, you know, he was positioning himself as a gay activist at that time, Milos Yiannopoulos, but he was also a huge supporter of Donald Trump's campaign. You know, he campaigned for Donald Trump in the US. And at this point, he was writing for Breitbart, Milos Yiannopoulos. So this is his response to the Orlando massacre. So Western capitalist democracy gave women and gays equal footing in society. Islam has arrived to roll the clock back. Christian right wing may not be totally down with homos, and Donald Trump may say things that hurt our delicate feelings, but they aren't going to kill us or put us in camps. Only Islam would do that. The same Islam that bizarrely now stands at the top of the left's hierarchy of victimhood. Furthermore, this isn't about radical Islam. This isn't a tiny fringe. In Britain, a 2009 Gallup survey found that not one Muslim believed that homosexual acts were acceptable, not one. And another poll this year revealed that over half of British Muslims believe gay sex should be illegal. Right, take a deep breath, everyone. So, I mean, again, this quote is a bit of a caricature. You can see that it's a bit over the top. I've still chosen it though, because I think it sort of has themes that you would find even in mainstream discourse about Islam and things like, you know, sexual minorities and inclusion of sexual minorities in contexts like the UK. Like it doesn't come out of nowhere, right? This kind of sentiment. So there's that. And I think it maps onto that homo nationalist, gay international securitization nexus of concepts, right? And you contrast it with this other response, and this was something that was on the Sunday program by a British imam that was asked to come on the program. And he was actually responding to a gay British Muslim activist, Asad Dunna, who was talking about organizing a big gay iftar in response to the Orlando shooting. So this is what Asad Zaman said, which I thought was interesting. It's quite nuanced, but just pay attention to it. Those who indulge in homosexual behavior, there are two ways of looking at them. If you acknowledge that homosexual behavior is sinful, then you are still within the domain of Islam, but you are a sinner. If you no longer regard homosexual behavior as sinful, then you are stepping outside the domain of Islam, because there are certain prohibitions that are hardwired in the Quran and they cannot be changed by anybody. So as I said, this is a more nuanced quote, and some of it, you know, does, you know, it is about a kind of traditionalist authoritative view of Islamic jurisprudence, right? But I still think there are so many sort of neo-colonial or colonial red flags in this statement as well. This kind of painting Islam as this static, monolithic entity, that where there are no-go zones that are unchallengeable. You know, I think just looking at the history of the way, you know, certain communities or behaviors were discussed in Islam, like literature about muhannath or khuntha. I think this is kind of an oversimplification as well, but that is the terrain that we are talking about, right?
Right, you have 10
and
minutes.
Thank you. And that has its continuities now. I mean, that was a particularly stark example at a particular moment in history, 2016. Then in 2019, when the Anderton Park protests happened, so this was a primary school in Birmingham that was rolling out an RSE syllabus for kids, which included things like queer and trans inclusion. Suddenly there was a group of Muslim parents that were protesting about this. I mean, a lot of you know about this, right? And the framing in the media was very much, this was about religious values versus sexual identity, versus liberal values about sexuality. And even commentators who were usually quite sympathetic, who would be quite critical about Islamophobia and xenophobia and racism, you know, commentators like Owen Jones, I think when they were responding to it, even if they were trying to be sympathetic, they still fell into this binary of Muslims on one side, LGBTQ people on the other side. And when you read headlines like this, you wonder, well, what about the people who are queer and Muslim? What happens to them? I think something that disturbed me as well, and it sort of, some groups did pick this up, some NGOs and commentators. Throughout this whole furor, even in papers like The Guardian, what was unmentioned was concerns about securitization, concerns about prevent, and you know what this program had to do with fundamental British values. And I think even the school itself, when it was trying to justify doing the syllabus in this way, they were like, teaching kids about inclusion will help with de-radicalization or something, right? There was something on those slides. So this connecting of sexual diversity suddenly became connected to a question of securitization, radicalization, and so on. And it's like, how did they make these two domains meet? What was this doing? And maybe this might have been something that made people anxious as well, right? Parents of Muslim kids. And this was unmentioned. Yeah, and just the question of calling, you know, the calls for these protesters for the law to be applied to them, for them to respect the law without discussing, without it being discussed that, you know, law and order itself is racialized, classed, and gendered. Anyway, so that's how I think it's continued. And this is, I mean, I said I didn't want to leave it there, and I don't. So this is where, you know, introducing you to Glamru and all those other references, EastEnders, We Are Lady Parts, and so on, the funeral director, this is where I think it becomes interesting. Because I think this is a strategy, you know, double consciousness is an experience, a way of looking at the world, a way of internalizing it. Multiple critique becomes a strategy. What are you going to do then? So this is Miriam Cook's concept. She's talking about Islamic feminists. And for her, it's about the ability to resist both heteronormative and patriarchal interpretations, practices of Islam, but also to resist neo-colonial and Orientalist discourses about Islam. And a lot of these neo-colonial and Orientalist discourses are feminist as well, right? A certain kind of feminism, I should say. So she's saying this is what Islamic feminists do. They have to have a multiple critique, and they move between these positions depending on where they are, who they're speaking to, and they're not necessarily frozen in these positions. And I think that's an interesting way to think about these cultural producers, these creative works that have emerged in the last 10 years or so in the UK. I mean, it's not in a vacuum. As I said, this is, I'm really confining my focus now. Some of you will know that in the third sector, there are these other Muslim collectives that have come out as well in the last 10 to 15 years in the UK, 10 to 20 years, I should say. So there are more queer sensitive and queer inclusive Muslim spaces in the UK. But I'm talking about using religion more as a creative or cultural resource. And I don't want to romanticize this. I mean, creative and cultural works emerge within a political and a particular political context as well, right? But just to give you a flavor of what I mean, you know, after all this, this kind of more tolerance, more inclusivity on the one hand, but also more spotlight on Muslims, more Islamophobia on the other hand, a play like this emerges, which I think is quite interesting.
The Allah I believe in, He's good, innit? He's kind. He wouldn't make me like this, love like this, only to condemn it. To make these feelings I have always had, to make him a sin. That would be a cruel God. And my Allah is not cruel.
So yeah, so that's the trailer for The Funeral Director. And I think, again, what's interesting is, you know, we are seeing different kinds of gender expression now as well. I think the initial phase of talking about queer Muslim experiences was quite male-centric as well, right? Even within the British context. And we are seeing different voices now emerging, talking about different queer Muslim experiences from gendered perspectives and ethnic and regional perspectives as well. I think this play was set kind of in the northwest of England as well, which was really interesting. So for my final two slides, I'm going to finish up now. I'm still thinking, what is the piece here that what is my focus here? So I sort of, to help me think through what I'm actually getting at, is I was thinking about the variables that are of concern to me. So one is, I'm wondering how many of these works resist or critique occurrences of Islamophobia and racism, right? How many of them are resisting or explicitly critiquing homophobia and transphobia? And, you know, I think when we talk about queer Muslims in the UK with, you know, this multiple critique, I think that's usually where a lot of the analysis ends, you know, the popular analysis. I think there's a third variable that we need to look at, which is colonial governance. I was trying to think of a category for this, and I don't know, we can have a discussion about whether this is adequate, but things like prevent, it's not just counterterrorism, because counterterrorism policies, I think, are an extension of, again, divide and rule, right? And what's divide and rule is a mode of colonial governance. So I was trying to plot where each of these works might fit, you know, in terms of their multiple critique of these three variables. And you can see where I've placed certain things there. So I think for the TV shows and the plays that I'm talking about, they're very well done, but things like The Funeral Director and We Are Lady Parts and Shades, I don't know if they have critique of colonial governance per se. You know, for Amru Al-Khadi's Life is of a Unicorn, I think that was interesting because it really did have, because they're Iraqi, they couldn't not, right? They have to talk about the invasion of Iraq at some point. And they have to talk about being a British Arab. Every time they've tried to audition for a TV show, they keep getting cast as terrorist number 1, terrorist number 2, terrorist number 3. So there is that. Yeah, but it is a memoir. So it's told as part of a memoir. I don't think it's unpacked so much. And I'm just thinking the stuff in pink is, you know, I was just grasping for ideas. I was like, what are the things that we've seen, you know, the cultural moments in the UK that would fit in these categories? I think maybe in the interest of time, I won't go too far ahead with this. I'll just end by saying this is an open question. I mean, things are still developing now. You know, a few weeks ago, we were still thinking about what's going to happen with these allegations of Islamophobia in the Conservative Party, with social movements in the UK, whether it's new Muslim movements or far-right movements? How is the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, the revival of ISIS and so on? How is this going to affect the terrain? And continuing hostile environment versus the gains that have been made since the step change in the Black Lives Matter movement in the UK. I think all of these make the situation still quite open. But also I think it's all of these things that I'm listing here also kind of make me think that, yeah, this variable of colonial governance is really an important part of the piece when we talk about queer Muslim experiences in the UK. And I guess I will end there for now because I run out of time. Thank you.